In a tale as intricately woven as Berserk, many moments can end up feeling pivotal. Oftentimes they are, but none have had a more drastic impact on the story than the moment where Griffith seduced Princess Charlotte. He saw it coming the first time he interacted with her in Chapter 7, but no one, not even Griffith himself, could have predicted just how suddenly it would go down, or how fundamentally it would alter the course of Berserk. Because while getting into Princess Charlotte's good graces and bedchambers was the Falcon's plan from the beginning, his execution of the same ended up causing the death of his dream the first time around. In this video, we're going to explore how Berserk would have changed had Griffith not slept with Charlotte in Chapter 38, and whether he could have still achieved his dream that way or not. Why Griffith needed Princess Charlotte? It wasn't as though Griffith needed Charlotte like a man needed a woman. The Falcon was unique, even amongst exceptional men, because as a commoner, he eyed a goal most nobles wouldn't. Where they would be content with their lordships and their meager castles, Griffith had his sights upon the highest summit, and the Band of the Falcon was but his first step towards it. He wanted to become king of not just Midland, but the entire world. However, launching such a conquest from his position with the kind of resources and backing he currently had would have been nothing more than a suicide mission. The right of conquest gave leaders legitimacy back in the days of Supreme King Geiserich, but the current timeline of Berserk was very different. Kingship isn't a title one could obtain by simply capturing territory. It had been spun into a complex web of political and religious alliances and indoctrination which could never be unraveled by a commoner. In order to protect their right to rule, kings tie their authority to bloodlines and religious orders, oftentimes both, and therefore, any other claim to their throne is immediately seen as unconstitutional. Over time, the people come to see royal families as part of their own families, and it's one of the key tenets to creating a sense of nationality. Breaking that kind of power with swords will only lead to illegitimacy and rejection, so Griffith's options were already limited. He couldn't just show up, take over a royal capital, kill the king, and usurp his throne. Robert Baratheon was called a usurper 17 years after he captured his throne, and this is after him having blood ties with the Targaryen dynasty. Griffith certainly possessed the aptitude and genius for throwing a kingdom into political chaos overnight, but he knew how that road would end. Death would be his only reward, and with that, his dream would be gone as well. If he had any hope of ruling over any territory with a shred of legitimacy, he needed a way to tie himself to its ruling family, which further reduced his prospects. The reason why most royal children grow up betrothed to another is because their parents want to preserve their family's power and status. Princes and princesses are a coveted match, which means that often a prince or a princess will be promised to someone even before they become adults. A child that hasn't been used as a political object is prone to making willful decisions that can upset the balance of power, unless they've been trained to take responsibility of their lives beyond themselves. While lesser lords might pass on their inheritance to a daughter in the absence of a son, it was rarely heard of when it came to ruling families. The only way a daughter's claim would be seen as legitimate was if she was the one who stood to inherit her parents' estate, and such a flaw would rarely be found in the estates of kings. This is why he must have decided to pledge himself to Midland, because it was the only kingdom in the world with a female heir in the form of Princess Charlotte. The King of Midland had 2 wives over the course of his life. The first wife he loved deeply, and Charlotte was a product of their union. When she died, he took a second wife as a political move, but he never loved her like his first. His daughter became his only solace, and the king never betrothed her to anyone, not even his nephew Adonis, as would be traditional. Griffith had served under the Tudor leader Gennin a few years prior to joining Midland. He must have weighed his options amongst the many noble families in the West and concluded that Charlotte was his best bet. If he wanted money and crushing influence over an entire religion, he would have targeted Farnace de Vandimian, the only daughter of the richest family in all the Holy See. But he didn't, because A, he knew Farnace didn't come with a throne, and B, she had 3 brothers, and C, her father was more likely to use him than the other way around. Frederico de Vandimian did not become the most influential man in the West by accommodating promising commoners like Griffith. He needed to infiltrate a kingdom that was weak and prone to external influence, which he found in Midland. Ever since they lost their key fortress of Doldry to the Tudors, Midland had been on a steep decline. After 100 years of constant warfare, they had lost more than they had gained, and with the princess not being used to secure political alliances by the king, Midland was in dire straits. Griffith recognized all of these factors and concluded that Princess Charlotte would be his fastest shortcut to becoming king in a legitimate fashion. He knew he couldn't just show up and ask for her hand in marriage. marriage, so he got to work on a plan that would make it all feel natural. Griffith first enlisted the Band of the Falcon to the Midland cause during the 100-Year War, and made sure he was the one securing key victories for his employer. His mercenary group had outperformed so many of Midland's knightly orders that Griffith gained peerage within 3 years of being with them, and was fast-tracked to the position of general. This was hinted by the fact that the Band of the Falcon was picked as the king's protection detail for the autumn hunt over the usual White Dragon Knights, Midland's highest military order. He kept pushing through one impossible hurdle after the other and delivered Doldry back to Midland using nothing but his own military order. In the meantime, he made his move on Princess Charlotte, and it worked because the sheltered princess thought Griffith was some sort of fairy tale character. He was a commoner, yet he had the sensibilities of a nobleman. He was a military leader, but he possessed the qualities of a philosopher. In their first meeting, Griffith kept the princess from falling over, and during their second meeting, he taught her how to make a leaf flute. An attempt at his own life furthered his cause because Charlotte thought that arrow was meant for her. And then at a victory ball, Griffith got her attention hook, line, and sinker by dripping her out in that medieval riz. The king was unaware of their budding relationship, and when the queen became aware of it, Griffith took her out, along with all the other enemies he had in the royal court. With his careful planning and maneuvering, he had positioned himself spectacularly for a covert coup d'etat, and then disaster struck. How Griffith messed up his own plans because of ego. Griffith had known that he would become a target the moment he gained period, so he used the nobility's animosity towards him against them. That attempt on his life we just mentioned was orchestrated by the leader of the White Dragon Knights and the king's brother, Count Julius. Although the king had made no official announcement, Julius's son, Adonis, was expected to be betrothed to his cousin's sister, Charlotte, so Griffith demanded Julius's head from Guts, and when he got Adonis's as well, he smiled a fiendish smile. No one ever caught a whiff of his involvement in the death of the king's blood relatives because his only accomplice was Guts. He had charmed Charlotte before this news reached her, and afterward, Griffith willingly played the role of her knight in shining armor. Before he departed for the penultimate battle of the campaign, she gave him the male half of a lodestone necklace, which was designed for lovers and given to her by her birth mother. That was the moment we knew she loved him. All Griffith needed to do was bide his time and get her to marry him once the dust had settled from all his other exploits. Charlotte's birth mother might be gone, but her stepmother was alive before Doldry, and she saw him giving that necklace piece to Griffith. She tried to chastise her and remind her that she was a princess and shouldn't be giving out her favors so easily, but privately, she knew the larger game at play. Moreover, the king's brother was her lover, and she knew that Griffith was involved in his death. So, she hatched a plan to kill the Falcon after he secured Midland's victory over Tudor. Griffith turned the tables on her by sussing her plan out of one of her lead co-conspirators. He then proceeded to fake his own death, round up his remaining enemies in a single location, and set it on fire, ridding him of all obstacles in one shot. Had the queen been allowed to live, another attempt at his life was certain, but she would also block his path to Charlotte. With her gone, all that remained was the king, and Griffith knew enough of his nature to not see him as a threat. By the end of chapter 32, he was at the cusp of grabbing his dream with his hands. He had become a count and a general. His band had been promoted to the status of White Phoenix Knights, and he had the princess in the palm of his hand. The people saw him as their heroic savior, his enemies knew him to be the devil himself, and if he had just kept his cool, Griffith could have realistically became the king within a year or two. Alas, that wasn't what causality intended for him because he threw away all that he had gained in a moment of powerlessness and ego. After helping his leader achieve the biggest accomplishment of his military career, Guts decided it was time for him to leave, and this was something Griffith couldn't abide by. If you've seen our video titled "What if Guts Never Left the Band of the Falcon?" or know anything about Berserk in general, you'll know that Griffith's reaction to Guts leaving was all over the place. The Falcon couldn't comprehend that a soldier of his wanted to leave his grasp after tasting all that glory. And it was made doubly worse by the fact that it was Guts who wanted to go. Guts had become integral to all of Griffith's plans for the future because he was the one man the Falcon implicitly trusted. He had shown all of his sides to the swordsman, and being told that he was leaving despite all that made Griffith spiral hard. He forced Guts to fight for his life and freedom and knew that he could lose the battle, but he convinced himself to win at all costs because if he couldn't have Guts, then no one could. Griffith lost, and that broke him mentally and emotionally. He needed to regain control over himself because when Guts left, he took all of Griffith's power with him. The Falcon had never been refused before, especially by someone he thought was in his control. The experience was so jarring for him that he ended up visiting Charlotte in the dead of the night. Griffith must have known that by doing what he was about to do, he was jeopardizing everything. Yes, seducing Charlotte was ultimately what he wanted, but he was moving up on the timeline at a dangerous pace. And even when he was with her, all he was thinking about was Guts. Once again, no diddy. The only reason Griffith showed up at Charlotte's chamber that night was because he needed to regain control over his narrative, which in his mind, he'd handed over to Guts. When he kissed the princess, it was as if he was pressing his tensions onto her brow, and when he tells her to take her fears and cast them into the fire, it's as if he's talking to himself. Griffith spends the entire night blowing Charlotte's mind with his moves, but Guts' departure keeps replaying in his mind. When she passes out due to the exhaustion, he touches the scar he sustained during their battle with Zod, and he cries. His political trump card was securing Charlotte's love for him, which he had just accomplished. He left behind his half of the lodestone and some flowers for her before he vanished the following morning, but that didn't fill the Guts-shaped hole in his heart. Perhaps that is why he was so nonchalant about getting captured by the castle guards on his way out, and why he taunted the king so blatantly once he knew his fate was sealed. Like we said in the last section, it was kind of weird that the King of Midland had not married off Charlotte yet, despite her being near 17 years of age. But the Falcon had figured out the reason, and it was the king's incestuous attraction towards his own daughter. Perhaps if he'd held his tongue, he could have found a way out of his situation, but his ego made him blame Guts for seducing Charlotte and getting caught. It sure as hell wasn't going to pass up the chance to expose the King of Midland as a sick, daughter-loving psychopath. Because of all these events, the Falcon was tortured into oblivion, and after a year of being kept at the brink of life and death, he decided to claim power his own way. But this leads us to our next question. What if Griffith hadn't slept with Charlotte that fateful day? Could Griffith have married Charlotte had he not slept with her? As we've established already in this video, getting into a royal family, especially as a man, is extremely difficult. This is because medieval inheritance laws preferred males over females, and even if he became a king consort instead of a king, Griffith would gain considerable political influence. This would also mean that the royal family's influence would diminish, and no family in power would allow that, because once that happened, it was only a matter of time before he got his wife to give him full control over the kingdom, and this could have happened with Charlotte had he been patient enough. The princess was already in love with Griffith before he consummated their relationship. The lodestone was proof of that. So all the Falcon had to do was bide his time and continue building her affections for him until they reached a point where Charlotte herself chose him as her husband. She was already 17 years old by the time Midland retook Doldry. She was a woman grown and could make her choices herself from a technical standpoint. Once word of their romance reached the world, the common people were sure to idolize it, because the kingdom's savior marrying its princess is the kind of fairy tale people want to see come to life. Only his enemies knew how terrifying of a person Griffith truly was. For the rest, he was the equivalent of a guardian angel, so once he had both Charlotte and the public, as well as court opinion on his side, the king's hand would have been forced. For all his disgusting inner thoughts and feelings, the King of Midland was unlike his contemporaries in that he truly believed in a meritocracy. He didn't promote the Band of the Falcon just because they had an impeccable war record and he wanted to prove a point to his courtiers. He did it because he truly believed in Griffith's capabilities. Before he began punishing Griffith in chapter 39, the king expressed his genuine regret at what had transpired because he had hoped that one day Griffith would lead the bulk of his armies. He had expressed immense faith in the Falcon when his advisors warned him against it, because he believed that true leaders weren't the ones with the right bloodlines, they were the ones with the right mindset. This definition of his is pretty similar to the one Griffith gave to Guts in the final chapter of the Black Swordsman arc, where he said he wanted to find his place in the grand plan of destiny. He knew that regardless of social status and wealth, there were only a few men in this world that made it work the way it did, and he wanted to know whether he could eclipse them. This shared ideology of theirs could have resulted in a mutually beneficial partnership for the ages, and with enough time, who knows, maybe the King of Midland would have agreed to betroth his Charlotte to Griffith willingly. But therein lies the second hurdle. The king's own feelings towards his daughter. In that same chapter we just mentioned, Griffith deduces that the reason the king hasn't married off Charlotte yet was because he wanted her to come to him. He had feelings for his daughter, who looked like the spitting image of her mother. The king had never gotten over his first queen and saw her in Charlotte to a rather disturbing extent. Everything we pointed out about royal marriages in the first section was something Griffith thought of as well, because we're sure he couldn't believe his luck when he found out Charlotte was still unmarried. But when he thought about it a little harder, the king's involvement became evident, and we don't think that that man would have let go of his daughter as easily as his armies. Once the king realized what Griffith was up to, he would have surely tried to have him killed without Charlotte's knowledge, because he gives that order many times over after his escape. However, if the Falcon managed to get his talons on a large chunk of the Midland regular army, it would tip things heavily in his favor. Public opinion was on his side following his band's performance during the 100-Year War. With a major portion of the army under him as well, and Princess Charlotte on his side, Griffith could have exposed the king's incestuous feelings to the world and let things play out in his favor. Or he could have blackmailed the king into marrying Charlotte to him and then abdicating the throne as well, because Griffith has proven time and time again that he would take any shortcut, no matter how outrageous or risky it was. To put it simply, yes, Griffith could have married Charlotte in a dozen different ways if he'd just kept his cool about Guts' departure, and he wouldn't have had to sleep with her to do it either. Alas, causality had other plans for him, and he turned into a Demon King shortly after escaping Wyndham. But funnily enough, even on his new path to acquiring his dream, Charlotte remained a critical pit stop. How Griffith managed to make the best out of his worst decision. Sleeping with the princess took everything from him, but ironically enough, it was also the best decision he could have made for his actual attempt at acquiring his dream, not as a human, but as a god hand. In the 2+ years that he existed in the astral world, Princess Charlotte never stopped praying for his return. She had helped facilitate his escape and been a direct part of it for at least 50% of the way. Even when it became clear that she wouldn't see him anytime soon, Charlotte remained dedicated to his memory and would often embroider images of Griffith. She believed he would be her savior before the people did, and her prayers were answered in chapter 235. Following his incarnation into the physical world, the god hand Femto, now clad in the flesh of Griffith, resumed that man's journey where it had dropped off. He rebuilt the sacrificed band of the Falcon with the very creatures that feasted upon their flesh. He then made these apostles liberate human territories and fight alongside them. Once he had a secure enough base, he rescued Princess Charlotte from her captor, the Kushan Emperor Ganishka, who had invaded Midland in the wake of the king's death. With the king gone, Charlotte was now the queen of Midland, and the queen had only prayed for one thing in the 2 years following her discovery of her father's perversion, the return of her savior. When he finally rescued her, Charlotte thought it was a dream, but upon realizing that it was reality, she handed him everything that he needed to make his new dream a reality, and then some. Charlotte thinks Griffith loves her the way she loves him. She isn't aware of the fact that his heart is frozen, he's a demon, and that he's playing her much like that leaf flute which stole her heart. So, when he saves her like a prince from a fairy tale, it confirms to her that this is the man she wants to be with. She quickly arranges a betrothal between herself and him, and also gives him command over the entire Midland regular army, not just a large chunk of it like her father would have. In just one night, Griffith had set up his rapid rise to power down the line, and for that, we cannot say seducing Charlotte was the wrong move for him, all things considered. It's what formed the basis for his current power, as he's king of Midland and mankind in all but name. As Charlotte's soon-to-be husband and the leader of all Midland and Holy See armies, Griffith already rules the world. He's simply lacking the title. That too will be his soon enough, because while Charlotte has already promised her hand to him, their marriage hasn't officially taken place. Griffith is king in an acting capacity, and should the princess choose to do so, she could very well strip him of his post and banish him from Falconia, because Charlotte is the city's official ruler, not Griffith. But that will happen the day Guts gives up his sword and takes up sewing as a profession, so we wouldn't hold our breath over it if we were you. In the end, the Falcon managed to make the best out of the worst decision of his life, but it took him 2 years, untold torture, and thousands of lives to get there. Marvelous verdict! Griffith and Charlotte's relationship is a Shakespearean tragedy waiting to play out, because you can bet Charlotte will have a Kafka-esque meltdown upon realizing Griffith's true nature. But until then, she's given him everything he needs and more out of a false sense of love, which wouldn't have occurred without that night of passion. But that's just our take. What do you guys think about all of this? Is this the most cursed relationship in Berserk? Can it even hold a candle to what Griffith did to Casca? Let us know in the comments what you think, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.